10 days before the second referendum on whether Australia should introduce conscription in 1917, the Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, visited the border district campaigning for a yes vote. The local newspapers reported that Hughes was cheered lustily. In Albury, such scenes of enthusiasm were never before witnessed in the town. The cheers from his meeting could be heard 2 miles away. But within the quiet of the polling booths, the majority of local places, the 2 federal electorates abutting the border, and Australia as a whole, voted no. Why? We can never really know why people vote as they do, but we can look for voting patterns and try to unravel voting circumstances. We can try to assess something of the economic and or social change of particular places, which might indicate why residents may have voted as they did. Some border districts voted decidedly no, and some voted decidedly yes. In general, the pattern of votes by place was persistent from one year to the next. Prime Minister Hughes was concerned that recruitments were declining. Conscription was necessary to meet the battlefront needs. Yes vote campaigners insisted that a no vote was disloyal to the men serving on the front and would not help win the war. When the vote failed in 1916, analysts were quick to suggest that Western Australia may have voted yes because it was predominantly English settled. By comparison, South Australia may have voted no because it was German settled. Victoria tended to vote yes, and there were deep pockets of no votes in rural New South Wales. North and south of Albury, long-established Germans had an extensive network of Lutheran churches and schools, where they retained the German religion and language. Locally German-settled areas tended to vote no. Further, there were 3 political complications that help explain the campaigns and perhaps the vote. Women had won the right to vote, and referendum campaigners targeted all women. After all, they were half the electorate. Mothers especially were urged to vote yes, to spread the anxieties of war evenly, to share the equality of sacrifice. Campaigners cleverly inverted the message of each other. No campaigners were not reassured that conscription would only be for single men. Britain had conscripted single men, then within 3 months extended conscription to married men. Every married woman with children faced a life of poverty as a widow, with the loss or incapacity of the family breadwinner. Women were not just consumers of campaign materials, many of them took an active part. Local newspapers warned women about being misled by propaganda and urged them to vote yes. The second complication was the rise of the Labour Party. The Trade Union Party was looking increasingly like a party that took care of ordinary people, particularly country people. Australia was led by Labour Prime Ministers, first Andrew Fisher, then Billy Hughes. John Parker Maloney was the first federal ALP member for Indi. Across the river, John Joseph Cusack was the first Labour member for the state seat of Albury. Prime Minister Fisher had promised Australia would support Britain to the last man and the last shilling. But the Labour movement worried about the shillings coming from business. It seemed to some that this was a class war. The wealthy, parsons and snobs supported yes, and ordinary people supported no. Almost worldwide, Labour organised resistance to conscription, claiming that the wealthy would profit from war. Parker Maloney, the member for Indi, asked why government didn't conscript the assets of the big shipping companies to get rural produce to England. A third complication to the politics of the time was the growth in what was called the rural vote. Rapid increase in wheat farming and closer settlement opened the district to mixed farming. The border district countryside was making the transition from a pastoral to a mixed farming economy. It was becoming more closely settled. There were more rural voters than ever before. It was in their economic interests for rural people to oppose conscription. for it would rob them of rural labourers in what were good seasons. Parker Maloney argued that the man in the paddock, the man on the wagon, the village blacksmith were all contributing to the war effort by producing the food Europe so urgently needed. Fill the boats, he argued, with rural produce, not conscripts. In 1917 the Labour Party split, with some following Hughes into his new and cleverly named Nationalist Party. At elections in May there was a sharp shift from Labour. Both Cusick and Parker Maloney lost their seats. The Prime Minister appeared in the electorate during the election campaign to attack Parker Maloney, who was replaced by a strong conscriptionist. In August 1917 there was a big 5-week-long trade union strike, fired in part by rapid rise in food costs. There were protest demonstrations and arrests in Melbourne and Sydney. For those who saw defence as being the prime national interest at the time, the strike seemed more helpful to the enemy than to Australia. Through 1917 the battlefront news was not good, and recruitments were low. Prime Minister Hughes decided on another referendum. His Win the War Nationalist Party had won an election. His Labour Party opposition seemed divided and unpopular. This would be a reinforcements referendum. He did not expect the voters to say no again, but they did. Nationally and locally, the vote for no was slightly higher. Perhaps people had grown war-weary. The prospect of fighting through another European winter drew a sharp increase in requests to the Department of Defence for the release of family members from military duty. Perhaps voters were unwilling to compel young men to kill or be killed, to maim or be maimed. Perhaps they thought conscripting men to fight was more a moral than a political question. Most local booths seemed to have proportionately consistent returns. Perhaps, after all, within the privacy of the polling place, people persisted in viewing their personal and family needs ahead of district, national, or empire needs. These were for a generation broken years. This was a broken country. The border district and its towns were not broken by war, but they divided as fragmented communities with deep divisions emphasised with bitter debates on conscription.